Welcome back. A nationwide company that collects plasma donations says it's experiencing a shortage. Now, when a woman in Omaha is sharing how plasma saved her life, it's an effort to urge others to donate, Lauren.
Yeah, 6 News' Johan Marin spoke with her about her journey.
I just feel grateful that I'm alive because of plasma.
It was 2008 and Elyse Kenny was only 17 years old when she crashed her car into a tree. The impact of the crash shattered her femurs, knees, and ankles. The only thing Kenny recalls from the accident is her not wearing a seatbelt.
Did not walk unassisted for, I would say, about a year.
Kenny lost a significant amount of blood, and the only option to save her life was a plasma transfusion.
Yeah, I was really anemic because I lost a lot of blood. And I was very underweight because I couldn't move around a lot. I couldn't perform really anything outside of laying in a hospital bed, laying in a bed at home.
According to the American Red Cross, plasma transfusions are given to people in traumatic situations to stop bleeding. It took a while for Kenny to physically recover from the accident. However, she didn't let that define her mobility. She recently became a powerlifter.
The residual pain I was having since switching to like a powerlifting style program, it's like alleviated a lot for me, which has been a surprise.
Ever since her accident, Kenny works at Octapharma Plasma as a quality assurance supervisor here in Omaha to help people. They have plasma donation centers spread out all across the U.S. They've experienced a shortage since the start of the pandemic, and they've also had trouble helping patients who are in need of plasma.
In 2020, when COVID kind of took over the world, a lot of people were not donating, and you know, that was in large part due to the fact that we had, you know, lockdowns and people were just staying home in general, which was unfortunate because people need plasma donations. We need to give plasma in order to make the medicines that are derived from plasma, the raw product that we make here at Octapharma.
Kenny says people with autoimmune diseases rely on plasma for their medication.
Plasma is not like Tylenol or Aleve, where it can just be made at like a plant or a manufacturing house. I mean, people have to come in, they have to donate, they have to be willing to give us some of their time in order to make that raw product.
Kenny says there are thousands of people out there who are in need of plasma, and she encourages those who can donate to give a person another chance at life. On your side in Omaha, Johan Marin, 6 News.
And if you're interested in donating plasma, we'll have more information on our website, WOWT.com.